Like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. The town of Briars Hollow never made headlines, never hosted anything louder than a county fair or a parade of aging tractors carrying hay bale kings, and for decades it had existed under a blanket of quiet that made outsiders describe it as peaceful, though those who lived there long enough understood that the quiet was more like the tension between breaths, a kind of held-in stillness that felt more like waiting than calm, a silence so deep that when the massacre finally came, the survivors, there were only 6, would later say that it felt less like something new happening and more like something old finally waking up, unfolding itself from beneath the dirt, the walls, the skin of the town itself. But before the blood, before the screams, before the night when every light went out and every door swung open on its own as if welcoming something in, there was the last normal day, a tired Wednesday in late October when the air tasted of wood smoke and distant rain, when the schoolchildren trudged home beneath a sky the color of bruised peaches and the wind carried something faint but unmistakably wrong, a smell like wet metal mixed with hot breath, though most brushed it off as the scent of the incoming storm. All except for Lena Hargrove, a grocery cashier who worked late shifts and kept her long black hair tied back tightly as if afraid something might catch it, and who, at exactly 6:47 p.m., while closing down her register, saw a man standing across the street. Not really standing, more like leaning into the shadow of the hardware store, watching her with a posture too stiff to be natural and a head too still to belong to someone alive. His face barely visible as though a thin haze hung over it, and though he vanished when she blinked, she felt the echo of his stare like cold fingertips running down her spine. She told herself it was nothing, just exhaustion, and walked home through the creeping dark, unaware that the same figure had been seen earlier. That day near the elementary school, staring through the chain-link fence as the children played, unmoving, unblinking, and by nightfall, near the old mill, by a couple returning from the diner, who had sworn they heard wet footsteps following them even though the road behind them was dry as bone. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Reeves sat alone in his station reviewing an anonymous letter dropped into the slot that morning. A letter with no return address, written in shaky red ink that smelled disturbingly like iron, the message reading only, "It begins on the night without wind," a phrase that clung to him like mildew, but he had no context, no crime to anchor it to, so he crumpled it and tossed it aside, unaware that the night ahead would have no wind at all, not even the faint rustle of leaves, not even the usual whisper of the river behind town, only a great and unnatural stillness, as if the air itself had been stunned into silence. But before that stillness came down like a lid. Over the town, there were warnings, small ones, almost easy to overlook. The dogs that refused to go outside after sunset, whining and clawing at the doors. The televisions in 3 houses that turned on by themselves, all tuned to static overlaid with a faint rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat. The school janitor who swore he saw bloody handprints appearing on the inside of a locked supply closet. The old cemetery caretaker who heard children laughing between the gravestones even though no children were around. And the power flickers reported by half the neighborhood, lights dimming for exactly 6 seconds, then returning as though nothing had happened. But the biggest warning, the one everyone should have recognized but didn't, happened at 10:12 p.m., when every phone in Briars Hollow rang at the exact same time. Hundreds of ringtones echoing across the town like a choir of alarms as each resident picked up and heard nothing but a single whisper spoken by a voice that seemed both distant and inside their own heads. "Look outside," it breathed, and though most people froze in fear and put the phone down, a handful obeyed, drawing back curtains or opening blinds, and they all saw the same thing. Figures, dozens of them, maybe more, standing perfectly still along the streets, on sidewalks, in front yards, shoulder to shoulder like a procession of mannequins carved from shadows, their faces indistinguishable, their bodies twitching only slightly like puppets suspended by invisible strings, each tilting its head slowly toward the ones watching, not walking, not speaking, not attacking, just existing where no person should be, and as quickly as panic could rise, the power surged and went out completely, plunging everything into darkness thicker than ink. Lena Hargrove was one of the unlucky ones who had looked outside, and when the lights died she backed away from the window and pressed herself against the wall, her heart banging like a trapped animal in her chest, listening to the sound of footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps, outside her door, too heavy to be ordinary, too deliberate to be random. Across town, Sheriff Reeves scrambled to start his generator, the small station trembling as he heard what he thought was distant thunder but realized was something much closer, like the pounding of hundreds of bare feet hitting pavement in a rhythm that grew faster, louder, more frenzied, until it became a kind of stampede circling the town. Meanwhile, up on Briar Hill, at the old abandoned church that no one visited anymore, a light flickered to life. No electricity available, yet a red glow pulsed from within as though the building itself had been lit from the inside by hot coals, and those who saw it from afar would later describe the glow as moving, swirling, as if something inside the church was stirring its own blood. The silence deepened, heavy and absolute, and then the screaming began. Not one scream, not a dozen, but hundreds at once. Erupting from every corner of Briar's Hollow, a piercing, animalistic shriek that rose so high it sounded like glass shattering inside the air, and within minutes, doors were forced open, windows shattered inward, shadows moved with a predatory fluidity unnatural to any human body, and the massacre began, though no one who lived through it could fully describe what they saw, because the shapes were both human and not, their limbs bending in ways bones shouldn't bend, their mouths stretching impossibly wide, their eyes reflecting no light at all, and they tore through the town with a hunger that felt ancient, purposeful, almost ritualistic, leaving behind nothing but blood on walls and silence between houses. Lena fled into the night, barefoot, dodging silhouettes that lunged at her from behind broken cars, from beneath porches, from rooftops where shadows perched like vultures. Sheriff Reeves managed to gather 2 deputies, but both were gone within minutes, dragged screaming into the dark by unseen hands, and the town, the quiet town that had existed in a limbo of stillness for decades, finally revealed the truth of its silence. It wasn't peaceful, it wasn't calm, it wasn't sleepy. It had been waiting, holding its breath until the night when the doors between worlds folded open and what lived underneath Briar's Hollow crawled its way back to the surface, eager to finish what it had started long ago, eager to reclaim the land that had once been its feeding ground, eager to drench every surviving second of the town in the sound of human suffering. And in the final moments before dawn, as Lena reached the tree line and dared to look back at the hell consuming her home, she understood the truth that no one else had seen until it was too late. The massacre was not random, not chaotic, not senseless. It was intentional, a cleanse, a harvest, a ritual completed under the night without wind, and the thing leading the shadows was the same figure she had seen on the street earlier, the same one watching the school children through the fence, the same one who had stared into the windows of half the town, and when its face finally lifted toward the faint gray of approaching dawn, she saw that it had no face at all, only a smooth surface like wet clay stretching as though something inside was trying to push through, and as its head tilted toward her, she heard the whisper again, this time louder, this time unmistakably directed at her. "You were meant to stay," it breathed, and the forest behind her suddenly filled with the sound of something huge, many-legged, crawling down the slope toward her, leaving her with only one choice: run deeper into the woods and hope the monsters behind her were slower than the one ahead. The first body was discovered at dawn, and although the officers had seen plenty of death in their careers, nothing prepared them for the nauseating spectacle lying half-submerged in the drainage ditch behind the abandoned farm. Ribs splayed outward like snapped branches, the jaw twisted far beyond where flesh should allow, and the eyes missing as though scooped out with ritual precision. And as the sheriff stared at the mutilated corpse with trembling disbelief, he muttered that this wasn't the work of any animal in the region, not even a deranged killer, but something else entirely, something that killed without hesitation or mercy, something that wanted to be seen. And as word spread across the small town, families locked their doors early, children stayed inside, and the whispers began again. The whispers that had never fully faded, the rumors of the massacre that happened on this same land 40 years ago, when more than 20 people vanished within a single October night, leaving only blood trails that led nowhere and testimonies of survivors who went insane within weeks, babbling about shadows that crawled without legs and a sound like metal scraping bone. Now, with a new corpse found in the same cursed field, those ancient fears resurfaced like rot breaking through old floorboards, and the sheriff, despite his hardened resolve, felt a chill deep in his sternum, because he knew the signs. Knew the tight circular cuts around the victim's limbs meant the creature, or killer, had returned, and that the massacre wasn't a legend, wasn't a ghost story, but a cycle restarting after decades of silence. The investigation team expanded. Drones flew over the derelict barn where locals swore screams once seeped through the walls, and the red-haired forensic officer, Lynn Carter, noticed something else that made her stomach drop: 3 sets of footprints around the corpse. But each footprint was wrong. Toes bent backward, heels shaped like an animal's, and the stride almost impossible for any biped, and she said quietly, more to herself than to her colleagues, whatever did this wasn't alone. A truth amplified when they found claw marks across the old barn door, deep enough to carve through solid pine, each mark spaced like elongated fingers dragging downward with deliberate, almost mocking force. And that night, while the sheriff reviewed photographs under the dim lamp in his office, he heard something tapping against the window, a slow, deliberate tapping as though someone or something wanted his attention. And when he looked, there was nothing. Only the reflection of his own tired face and the distant hum of the town shutting down early out of fear. Yet the tapping returned twice, then stopped, leaving him with the unsettling realization that he was being watched. Meanwhile, Lynn, unable to shake the dread gnawing at her ribs, returned to the barn alone with a body camera and flashlight, ignoring the sheriff's order to stay out of the field at night. And as she stepped inside, the stale air thick with mildew and the scent of old blood, her beam caught something scrawled across a support beam in dried crimson. Words, but not in English, shaped like spirals intersecting jagged triangles. A pattern repeated all across the barn as if drawn in a frenzy, and she recorded everything, whispering shakily into the mic that this wasn't just murder, it was ritualistic. And moments later she heard a soft shifting sound behind her, like a knee bending backward, and when she spun, her light landed on a figure crouched atop the rafters, naked, emaciated, its limbs tremoring with unnatural speed, its head jerking in tiny animalistic twitches. And as the light hit it fully, she saw its face. No eyes, only a smooth glossy surface where they should be, and a mouth stitched wide open as if forced into a permanent grin. And before she could scream, the creature leapt down with a rattling snap of movement, knocking the camera sideways, but the feed kept recording its elongated fingers curling around her throat, lifting her effortlessly as her legs kicked helplessly, and her gurgling choke echoed through the barn while the creature turned its blank face toward the camera, cocking its head in a grotesque imitation of curiosity. By the time the sheriff found the barn 2 hours later, following the GPS ping from Lynn's body cam, her body was gone. Only her empty badge remained in a pool of congealed blood, and the sheriff, overcome with fury and crushing guilt, punched the wall so hard his knuckles split. But before he could call transport, he froze, noticing that the spirals written on the beams had been redrawn, fresh, still dripping, and surrounded by fingerprints that weren't human, each long and pointed like talons dragging through wet paint. And as the wind outside groaned and the barn seemed to breathe on its own, the sheriff swallowed the rising panic and radioed for backup, unaware that the massacre was now fully awakening, and they were already far too late to stop what had been waiting beneath the soil for generations. Something ancient, something communal, something hungry. The search for Lynn Carter stretched into dawn, but by the time the sun tinted the horizon with weak orange light, the sheriff knew they weren't looking for someone alive. They were looking for someone claimed, and the tension in the town coiled tighter as news of her disappearance spread, causing residents to barricade doors and whisper about the curse that had supposedly died with the last generation. And amid the rising panic, a small group of survivors and witnesses began to form, or more accurately, were pushed together by fear. There was Julie Merrow, the school bus driver who saw a figure sprint across the road at 3 a.m. moving on all fours like a spider made of human limbs. There was Tom Reed, the hunter whose dogs refused to go near the northern woods, whimpering and urinating themselves whenever something unseen passed between the trees. There was Maria Ellis, the teenage girl who claimed her sleep paralysis demon now stood at the foot of her bed even when she was fully awake. And finally, there was Dr. Harold Bexley, the historian who arrived from out of town after hearing the news, insisting he knew the truth behind the land's violent past, and though the sheriff resisted at first, he eventually gathered them in the old storm shelter beneath the police station, where the dim yellow light cast long shadows across the concrete walls, and Bexley unrolled a brittle parchment nearly a century old, covered in symbols identical to those painted inside the barn, explaining that 40 years ago, a traveling cult settled briefly on the land, conducting rituals that were meant to remove the eyes of God, words that chilled everyone to their core. And he went on to describe how the cult's followers believed sight itself was a curse, believing salvation would only come by summoning beings that existed without eyes, beings that hunted not through vision but through vibration and breath, creatures described as walking gates between the living and the dead who fed on fear, and that the massacre all those years ago wasn't accidental or random, but the completion of a ritual meant to permanently open a doorway below the earth. As Bexley spoke, the survivors realized something horrifying. The new attacks weren't a copycat, and they weren't beginning. They were continuing, exactly 4 decades after the last cycle, exactly as the cult had planned. And as the sheriff struggled to process the idea of a ritual spanning generations, Tom Reed reported something that froze the room. His trail cameras were triggering every night, capturing blurred humanoid shapes that twisted mid-frame into impossible positions, and the last video showed a pale figure standing inches from the camera, head tilting in a broken jerk, mouth stretched far too wide before the feed cut to static. Not long after, screams echoed from the edge of town, forcing the sheriff and his group out into the open, rifles ready, flashlights slicing through the early morning haze as they rushed toward the sound, finding the Johnson family front door shattered inward and the father lying on the floor twitching violently, throat torn open as if by claws. But what made Maria collapse in horror was the fact that his eyelids were gone, ripped away cleanly, exposing eyes that had been carved out and placed neatly on the kitchen table in a pattern that matched the symbols from the barn. And as the survivors backed away in terror, a low groaning sound drifted through the house, vibrating the walls like a massive breath drawn from some unseen chest deeper inside, and the sheriff whispered, "Everyone out now," just as the hallway darkened, not from shadows but from something tall stepping into view, its limbs too long, its movements sharp and disjointed like a marionette pulled by invisible strings, and Julie screamed as it lunged, but the sheriff shot it point blank in the chest, knocking it back long enough for them to escape into the yard where the last remaining neighbors had gathered with bats and kitchen knives, trembling as the windows inside the house exploded outward from the force of the creature smashing through them. The sheriff didn't have time to form a plan as 3 more shapes emerged from the tree line behind the house, each as eyeless and contorted as the first, and the survivors fled toward the storm-drained tunnels while the creatures scattered the crowd like dry leaves in a hurricane, ripping into anyone too slow with a hunger that felt ancient and deliberate. And as the screams multiplied behind them, the sheriff forced everyone down the rusted ladder into the tunnels, slamming the hatch as something above slammed into it hard enough to bend the metal. The darkness below was suffocating, the air thick with the stench of stagnant water and something older, and Bexley's hands shook violently as he pulled out another sheet of parchment, whispering that the creatures weren't demons. They were guardians, protectors of whatever was buried beneath the valley, awakening now because the seal had weakened, possibly broken by Lynn's blood on the barn floor, and the tunnel around them vibrated as though something massive was crawling on the surface, and Julie began to sob, insisting she could hear whispering behind her, whispering that knew her name, whispering in her mother's voice though her mother had been dead for 6 years. Without warning, a section of the tunnel ceiling gave way and a skeletal hand plunged downward, grabbing Maria by the ankle and dragging her screaming into the collapsing earth before anyone could react, her voice fading into the dark as Tom reached desperately into the dirt only to pull back a chunk of her bloodied shoe, They had no choice but to keep running, water splashing under their boots as the whispers in the tunnel seemed to multiply, echoing in hundreds of overlapping voices, and Bexley suddenly stopped, shining his light on a massive stone seal embedded in the tunnel floor. 1. That matched the drawings on his parchment, and he whispered with terror thick in his throat that this wasn't a collapse site, this was the doorway itself, the place where the ritual ended and the massacre began. And as he leaned forward to examine the cracks forming along its circumference, the sheriff begged him to leave it alone, but it was already too late. From beneath the stone came the unmistakable sound of scratching, slow and methodical, like fingernails dragging across wood from the underside of a coffin, and the survivors backed away as the stone began to rise from the ground, moved not by machinery or hydraulics but by something pushing up from below, something large enough to shift a 300-pound slab like it was cardboard. And for the first time, even the sheriff prayed, not for safety, but for the mercy of a quick death, as the seal broke, releasing a blast of freezing air that extinguished every flashlight except one. And from the pit below came a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that signaled the massacre wasn't just returning. I don't know how I kept moving after witnessing everything inside that cursed town hall. The screams, the shadows, the way the lights flickered like the whole building was breathing. But adrenaline dragged me forward like a rope tied around my spine, pulling me into darkness that didn't care if I lived or died. And as I stumbled out into the open night air, the cold hit me like a slap, freezing the sweat on my skin and forcing me to accept the horrifying truth that this nightmare wasn't just happening inside. It was spreading across the town like a disease, because the street outside, Main Street, the place where my mother used to buy groceries and where I'd biked past the old candy shop as a kid, was now flooded with a thick, rolling fog that moved with purpose, like it had eyes, like it was searching for someone specific, and for a moment I thought I saw faces in it, screaming mouths stretching in silence, begging to be let out. And I knew then that the massacre wasn't just physical but spiritual, something that reached deeper than bloodshed, something older than anything we understood. The fog swirled around the lampposts, which flickered weakly, casting long shadows that twisted and flexed even though nothing solid stood there. And as I backed away, clutching the rifle I'd taken from one of the fallen officers, I heard guttural chanting echo from the alleys, a layered sound like dozens of voices speaking in a language I couldn't recognize. And when the fog parted, for a second I saw them, the silhouettes of the possessed townsfolk, their bodies jerking like puppets with tangled strings, eyes glowing with that same sickening red haze that I'd seen in the mayor's eyes before he tore apart his own deputy. I ducked into the old hardware store as they approached, slamming the door and barricading it with a fallen shelf, my heartbeat hammering so loud I was certain they could hear it. And as I crouched beneath the counter, I whispered to myself that I needed to survive, if only to expose what had happened here and make sure no one else ever walked into this place unaware. But the whispering followed me inside, crawling through the cracks in the walls, getting louder and more insistent until I couldn't distinguish the voices from my own panicked thoughts. And then suddenly a hand slammed against the window. A pale hand, long fingers, nails cracked and blackened, and the glass began to throb like it might shatter any second. I rose slowly, tightening my grip on the rifle, and stepped toward the back exit. But before I reached it, the floorboards under me creaked in, a strange rhythm, like heartbeats, and I realized too late that the fog wasn't outside anymore. It was seeping through the vents, coiling around my ankles, rising like a living thing that wanted to drown me. So I ran. I kicked the back door open and sprinted into the alley, nearly slipping on the slick puddles that reflected the burning town like some hellish mirror. And as I rounded the corner, I saw someone standing at the end of the alley, a little girl in a torn dress, swaying slightly, her face dirty and streaked with dried tears. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and for a moment I thought maybe she was human, maybe she was a survivor like me. But then her jaw unhinged too far, stretching down in a grotesque angle that no living human could survive, and from her throat came that same unholy chant I'd heard in the town hall. I pointed the rifle at her, but my finger froze on the trigger because deep inside her eyes I saw something. Fear, begging, a trapped soul trying to claw its way out, and before I could react, A shadow surged from the rooftops above, landing behind her, a tall, skeletal figure wrapped in the fog like a cloak, its limbs too long, too thin, its head bent sideways as though it were listening to something underground. That was when I understood. This thing was the conductor, the orchestrator of the massacre, the one controlling the townsfolk like puppets, and it lifted the girl gently, almost lovingly, before tossing her aside like a broken doll and turning its hollow face toward me. I fired, not out of bravery but pure terror, and though the bullets tore through its body, the thing didn't fall. Instead, every wound released more fog, thick plumes that hissed and writhed, forming snarling faces that lunged toward me. I turned and ran again, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, but the creature moved like liquid shadow, always appearing in the corner of my vision, always one step behind me, until I reached the school courtyard where the massacre first began earlier that night. And there, amidst the bodies and overturned benches, stood Sheriff Dalton, alive, bloody, barely standing, but alive. "It's after you now," he rasped, pointing his shaking gun at the fog. "You're the one it marked." Before I could ask why, the creature stepped into the courtyard, and Dalton fired, each shot lighting up the fog like lightning inside a storm, but the bullets did nothing. The sheriff, with his last breath, pushed me toward the school's basement door and shouted, "End it where it started!" Then he turned and faced the creature as it surged toward him, and I watched in helpless horror as it enveloped him completely, his scream echoing until it dissolved into silence. With no time to mourn, I forced myself down the basement stairs, slamming the iron door shut behind me, and deeper inside I found the old boiler room glowing with that same unnatural red light I'd seen in the mayor's office, the light that pulsed like a heartbeat, leaking from cracks in the cement floor. And there, carved into the ground, was a massive symbol, jagged and ancient, drawn in layers of dried blood. I realized then that the town wasn't cursed, it was chosen, picked as a vessel for something that needed flesh and fear to break through the barrier between worlds. As the fog seeped under the door and the creature's footsteps thudded above me, shaking dust from the ceiling, I remembered the lighter in my pocket and the gasoline cans stacked near the boiler, and I understood what needed to be done. If this thing was anchored to the symbol, then destroying it could stop everything. So I tore open the gas cans, dousing the walls and floor, coughing as the fumes burned my nose, and when the fog finally poured down the stairs like a waterfall, bringing the creature with it, its body unfolding like spider legs expanding, its face splitting open to reveal a gaping void, I flicked the lighter, my hand trembling, flame barely steady, and whispered, "Burn with us." I dropped it. The explosion was instant, a roaring eruption of flame and fury that consumed the room in seconds, swallowing the fog, the symbol, the creature, and me. But as the fire climbed up my arms, as the heat melted everything around me, I heard the creature scream, not in rage, but in fear, and the fog evaporated like steam. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the symbol cracking apart, its red light dying like an extinguished heartbeat. And then silence. When I woke, I was outside, on the street, covered in ash but alive, surrounded by firefighters and rescue crews who had arrived after the town's emergency broadcast finally went through. They asked what happened, what caused the explosion, where everyone was. But as I looked toward the smoking ruins of the school, I saw faint wisps of fog slithering back into the cracks of the earth, waiting, watching. And I understood the truth. The massacre was over, but the evil wasn't dead. It was only sleeping.